Our final presentation this evening is from Professor Sam Fankhauser, who is a director at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, not to be confused with the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial. He is the co-director of this institute and also a member of the Committee on Climate Change, and I think very well placed to give his opinion on this issue.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's very hard to be the fourth speaker after this series. I think you already have a very comprehensive picture of sustainable energy from a sort of more academic theoretical side, from a public policy side, and from a private investor side. So what I'm going to do, in a sense, is just to give you a few sort of anecdotes, shine the light on one or two areas where I think some important trends are happening when it comes to sustainable energy, particularly in BRICS countries, but perhaps a little bit broader as well. The context, which is also in a sense my summary slide, is that, as we've already heard, most future energy growth is going to come from emerging markets. There's going to be a lot of energy growth, as we've seen, and most of that is going to be in emerging markets, going to be in BRICS economies and big sort of Asian, Latin American, and perhaps even African markets. The flip side of that is something that Paul was very eloquent about, and we shouldn't forget, is that if we want to meet our climate change targets, the 2 degrees or whatever the number is that you attach yourself to, if you want to meet those targets, it's no longer the case that you can ignore emerging markets. It's not possible anymore to have any reasonable climate change target unless you bring in China, you bring in Brazil, you bring in India, and so on. So that's just an important piece of background, and that's why, in a sense, we talk about sustainable energy in the BRIC countries tonight. Sort of good news, bad news sort of things. The good news, the next piece of good news is there's a lot of push, actually. We've heard about Brazil, which is probably the leader in those areas, but there's a lot of legislative push on green economies worldwide in many countries, including in many emerging economies, and these things are perhaps done mostly for environmental reasons, but there are growth opportunities in there. And by growth opportunities, I mean the sort of thing that Paul talked about. Environmental protection does cost 1 year's worth of GDP 30 years from now. That's absolutely true. But within that aggregate number, there are business opportunities for companies like GE or other companies that sort of embrace, or countries for that matter, that embrace that green agenda. So that's my summary and my context. Let me dig a little bit deeper in some of those claims. One of my claims was that there's a lot of legislative action. The reason why I said that is based on a survey we did at LSE together with an organization called GLOBE, which is a network of legislators across G20 countries, roughly speaking. And so we started looking at the legislative books in 17 of those countries, and we started counting how many laws are there on the books of those countries that, broadly defined, have something to do with climate change, or sort of mostly climate change actually, but broadly defined. And we found 175 laws, so that's roughly 10 per country. So the legislative base is actually quite thorough, certainly in terms of numbers. But if you look at some of those laws, they're also quite detailed, quite good, quite comprehensive. We think in the UK that we're probably one of the sort of leaders on green legislation with our Climate Change Act of 2008. But if you look at that list, you see, again, a lot of action also in emerging markets, a lot of action in places like Brazil, like China, and Mexico, for example. Remember what Paul said about the 3 sort of key policy, generic policies that you need on sustainable energy that come out of the Stern Review. They had to do with putting a price on carbon, with removing the barriers to the efficient use of energy, and technology support for things like renewable energy technologies. Now look at the first 3 columns we have here from the survey. Those are exactly those 3 generic policies, and you see underneath it that in all those 17 countries, pretty much all of them have an X, which means these areas are covered. They even have an M in some cases, which means this is the main thrust of their green energy legislation. So you see in places like South Korea, for example, which has made green growth one of its core strategies, they put emphasis on putting a price on carbon, just as the UK does, just as the EU does, and just as Australia has recently started doing. But you see energy efficiency featuring very, very prominently in most countries, and you also see all countries have renewable energy legislation in one way or another. Countries like Brazil, Indonesia, obviously, with their big forest cover, they would sort of put an emphasis on forestry as well. Those, in a sense, are just the good news laws. Of course, there's a lot of bad laws in the books as well, and we've already heard what the amount of energy subsidies is that, to some extent, counterbalance the good things that we see here. But just based on that survey, there is a lot of good things happening. They do not add up to the sort of targets that we want to have, but they give us a platform. Let's sort of look at some of the BRICS countries in more details. The reason why they do these things is partly environmental concerns, absolutely, partly a sort of a desire to be environmental leaders, global leaders, but it's also partly the recognition that there are growth opportunities here, and that's certainly the combination that drives things in China. Many of you will have heard about the latest 5-year plan in China that covers the next 5 years. It makes a very sort of strategic decision to put money, emphasis, and resources on becoming the leaders in the green economy. They have identified 7 strategic sectors, which include a lot of energy. New energy is in there, energy conservation is in there, then a lot of other things like the next generation of cars and so on. And this is an area that the Chinese want to sort of increase by a factor 5 in terms of the contribution these sectors make to GDP. They're supposed to go up from 3% now to 15% by 2020. So it goes a little bit beyond the 5-year plan. Now, in the same time, between now and 2020, Chinese GDP will double. So that multiplier of 5 becomes a multiplier of 10 if you look at it in absolute GDP numbers. So by 2020, if the Chinese do what they say they will, and normally they do, that you sort of end up with a economy, a green economy, if you will, in those strategic sectors that's worth $1.5 trillion a year. And you can also sort of guess, and that's sort of something that Nick Stern has done, he's very good at these numbers, how much capital investment you will need if you want to have a 1.5 trillion green economy in 10 years, and you have to invest about 450 billion a year over those 10 years to reach that point. So there's a big sort of green growth investment opportunity in China. I sort of go back and forth between good news and bad news. Let me tell you, one of the more tricky BRICS countries when it comes to sustainable energy is Russia. We did a study together with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development looking at low carbon opportunities in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and it became very clear that countries like Russia will find it very, very hard to benefit from the green economy unless they start changing their ways. And what that means is that those currently very heavily resource-based economies, places like Russia, but also Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, for example, Turkmenistan, they really have to start diversifying away from that natural resource base. The couple of lines that you see here are lines from a model, and the model was run under different sort of assumptions of what the global climate change concentration constraint should be. Don't worry about the various numbers, those refer to CO2 concentrations, but basically what it says is that under business as usual, you would see oil production in the whole of the former Soviet Union go up quite significantly over this time frame that we have here, so almost the next 50, 70 years. But if you are serious about constraining greenhouse gas concentration, a lot of that oil has to remain underground. And that's bad news, obviously, if you're a country like Russia, because you have to diversify away from your main source of growth and income that you have at the moment. And that's going to be painful. There's no denying it. And yet, if you're serious about sustainable energy, you have to somehow convince Russia that this is what they want to do. Right. Let's look a little bit at industry as another piece of work as I sort of jump around putting the spotlight on various areas of sustainable energy. This is a study that we just completed, isn't quite finished in a sort of peer-reviewed sense, but it looks at green growth, very broadly defined, not just energy, green growth opportunities at the sector level in 8 countries. And we looked, so we have 8 countries, about 110 sector seats, so we have 880 sectors that we study, and we define 2 indicators, actually 3, that you see on this chart. On the y-axis is an indicator of green innovation. The question is how many green patents are being produced in a sector and country relative to the average. And if you're above 1, you're obviously better at green innovation than if you're below 1. The other indicator we have on the x-axis is a conventional economic indicator of comparative advantage measured as Balassa indicators for those of you who know these things, which measures your export competitiveness relative to other countries in the sample. And then the size of the bubble tell you what the size of those sectors, current output in those sectors is. So you can then start looking at pictures like the one we have here and start to wonder, just, basically just glancing at the picture, how good are BRICS economies? How good is China in this particular case in terms of its green innovation, in terms of its positioning in the green economy relative to, I put here Korea and Asia to make, Japan to make the Asian comparison. What you see is that Japan is still a hell of a lot better when it comes to green innovation than China is. China's sectors are mostly sort of below the line, so they do below average green patenting compared to Japanese sectors where green patenting is absolutely above average. I mean, a lot of that is cultural. Japanese companies, the heavy industry companies, have a culture that patenting is one of their performance indicators. China has perhaps more a culture of being a follower rather than a leader in these areas. It also has a completely different economic structure, or has had so far. But still, the story is, when it comes to green growth or green potential in the manufacturing industry, China is not quite there yet where that ambitious 5-year plan says they will want to be. Let me just quickly show the picture for Europe, which is a slightly frustrating one in many respects, but it also has opportunities in there. The best positioned country when it comes to green growth in Europe is Germany, probably not very surprising, which is doing quite well on green innovation in many sectors, particularly in some of the sectors where it already today has a comparative advantage. That big blob that you see here is the German car industry, which is not only very competitive, it's not only very big, it's also reasonably good at green innovation. If you look at the UK and Italy for that matter, you see a lot of sectors down here which don't do any green innovation at all, where the rest of the world is innovating, but the UK is not. A lot of that is agribusiness and sectors where you can say, okay, that's not particularly what we are doing. But there are also things in there like batteries, where you would have thought there's a lot of potential to be a leader in the green economy. Final slide to look at the same picture again, just for 2 sectors that are particularly interesting for sustainable energy. The sort of engine and turbines sector, which is on the energy supply side, if you will, and the electricity distribution sector, which has a lot to do with smart grids and is sort of slightly closer on the energy efficiency and the demand side. You see the blobs here are, you probably can't see it in the back, are the different countries, the 8 countries that we have in our samples. You see a very different sort of dynamics in those 2 sectors, and we see that in some sectors as well. On engines and turbines, again, oops, that was not what I wanted. On engine and turbines, China here and Korea here, the emerging markets are lagging behind. Obviously, they're not the leaders in these technologies today, so they're to the left of the x-axis, low comparative advantage today, but they're also not the big leaders, as it were, when it comes to green innovation. Japan, the US, and so on. So the current leading countries when it comes to engines and turbines are the leading countries also when it comes to the green economy. In electricity distribution, you can tell a slightly different story. You have some of the incumbents, Korea perhaps here, maybe even the UK, which are not the market leaders today, but which are good at green innovation and therefore potentially could leapfrog some of the current leaders that we have. So, just to repeat what I started off with, to sum up, energy growth mostly happens in emerging markets, therefore these markets are important. They're also important because of our environmental targets. We can no longer meet our climate constraints unless we work with emerging markets on these issues. But there's good news in two ways. One is that on the legislation side, a lot is happening, not enough, but a lot is happening. And on the investment business side, there are a lot of green growth opportunities that countries are starting to pick up. Let me close here and let's move on to the questions. Thank you very much.